very pleased to be here in Métis Region 5, part of Nipissing District, and of course the city of North Bay. I'm going to give you a briefing on what we call State of Ontario's northern regions. You'll notice that the regions are in red. One of my colleagues asked me why it was in red because, you know, it doesn't match the color scheme that we're allowed on NPI slides. And the reason it's in red is to remind me to make this point, which is something we didn't make last year, which is Northern Ontario is not a single region. I don't think that should come as any surprise to anyone in this room, but it does come as a remarkable surprise to policymakers in Toronto and in Ottawa. Timmins is not North Bay. North Bay is not Kenora. Kenora is not Sioux Lookout. What happens in North Bay, if things go well and you see expansion or investment, that's great, but that doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on what's happening in say, Scarborough or Terrace Bay. And so it's important for us when we talk about this, and you'll see us break it down a lot. Information is readily available, as I said, for Ontario as a whole. It's also reasonably available for what's called the Northeast and Northwest Economic Region. And then you get considerably more difficult as you delve deeper down in that. So we try at the very least to break out the data by the 11 census districts that are in Northern Ontario, and so you'll see us talk about those numbers in these slides. But I did want to start with that emphasis that Ontario North is made up of a group of regions, not a single region. And to the extent that any policymaker ever suggests that they're making policy for the North, you should correct them immediately, because the simple fact is cookie-cutter policies for the province of Ontario don't work, let alone for Northern Ontario as a whole. So the way this is broken down is we've got 6 sections. We've got the environment, we've got people, demographics, labor market, income, and economy. So let's talk about the environment. Environmental indicators for Northern Ontario are remarkably difficult to find, but the good news is those that we have been able to secure and look at are getting better. Boil water advisories continue to be a challenge in Northern Ontario, particularly Northwestern Ontario. But you see that in the First Nations in particular, we're still seeing far too many of those. That being said, the federal government certainly is making progress in moving forward. And on that note, I'm going to stop my presentation because guess who just showed up? And I want to emphasize the fact that I've noticed several politicians in the room, and I want to appreciate the fact that they're taking time away from trying to keep their jobs to come and talk to us. So thank you very much.
Annie, bienvenue, welcome. Il m'a fait plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui parmi vous. It is my great honor to bring greetings on behalf of the city of North Bay. I just want to recognize, one of my colleagues is here, George Marousas. George has been on council now for 102 years, George, somewhere around there. Brings vast knowledge, and he's as a businessman in our community. So I just want to recognize a hardworking councillor that I really enjoy working with and look up to. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance and being here in the city of North Bay. I'm going to blame Anthony Rhoda because he's not here on the weather, just so if you want to tell him that. We always joke back and forth who takes credit for the weather or who gets blamed for the weather. And Charles, you and your team, thank you very much. I've had the pleasure of speaking with you many times over the years and really believe in the Institute and Northern Ontario's way of life. We really, really take pride as Northerners in the way of life. And I look at the GTA area where you're stuck living on a highway. So please consider putting all your support behind the Institute in Northern Ontario. It is critical for our growth. As you know, we have a declining population and a declining birth rate. It's incredibly important that we grow and attract people north. And I think, is that Daryl Vinecourt over there? So I just want to recognize, sorry Daryl, I didn't see you sitting way in the back. I think you're one of the quietest councillors we have, but when you do speak, it means something. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop there and just welcome you and enjoy the day.
There you go. Now I have to turn that this way. I'm slightly shorter than the mayor. On the boil water advisories, I was about to point out again that on that front, the federal government has made a concerted effort to invest in those things, and I follow a lot of the various federal departments on Twitter, and it always brings a little bit of gladness to my heart to see another announcement that a boil water advisory has been removed. Not nearly as quick as they should be, but we're slowly making progress, and I think that's a positive sign. Another perspective we've got is around emissions per facility, and you tend to hear a lot about environmental degradation or pollution in Northern Ontario. Apparently, the assumption is that if you're hewers of wood and drawers of water, you must obviously be an environmental hazard. And one of the nice things about this data set is it shows us that on a per facility basis, we're much better than the rest of the province. Slight slippage in the northwest, but for the most part, we know how to do it right, and we're much more advanced in terms of controlling our emissions on a per facility basis. And so that's good news, I think, for the region as a whole, or for the various regions. Greenhouse gas emissions per large facility increased in some census districts, of course, and decreased in others. This again gets back to the message that it's not consistent when you talk about population, or you talk about emissions, you talk about transportation investment. It's not consistent district to district, and so there are things that are different. But for the most part, we're all going in a good direction. There's some questions around the Kenora area, but for the rest of us, we're either at or below where we were before, or well below the provincial average. So again, performance is looking good there. We've got emissions of fine particulate matter. Smog component per facility is higher in the northeast and northern Ontario than the rest of Canada. So this is an area where we can improve, and I think that's probably the key theme you're going to find in the message from this morning's presentation, is that we've got some things that are going well and we've got some things that are a problem, and so there's lots of work ahead of us to do. This is emission of fine particulate matter per facility, highest in Greater Sudbury and Manitoulin. So again, you look at the district level. So we show you the overall trend for northeast, northwest, and then we break it down by district just to give you a sense of where things are on a district by district basis. One of the things I forgot to mention when I get started is that these slides are available online, or will be, so you can. Don't worry, you don't have to absorb all the information in these slides with your eidetic memory. You can look at it later at your leisure and to take the numbers apart. So let's talk a little bit about the people. From the perspective, you talk about the people from the perspective of poverty, capacity to take care of themselves, those kind of things. Economic dependency is higher in the northeast than the northwest, and increasing since 2012. So these are the number of people who are receiving direct transfers to individuals from levels of government, whether federal or provincial. So we're not where we'd like to be, but the good news is we're not seeing a significant spike in these numbers, and that's cause for a little bit of satisfaction that even through the toughest times in 2008, 2009, we were able to take care of our own and keep people working. This is economic dependency by district. You see it's the highest in Manitoulin, Algoma, and Nipissing districts, so all in the northeast. And again, it's an identification that there are some areas that continue to be a challenge for us, and some regions where these kind of issues are more significant than other ones. Spending patterns. This is a good news story, I think, and it reflects one of the things that we don't do a very good job promoting for ourselves, which is lower proportion of households in the north spend 30% or more of their income on shelter costs compared to Ontario. I don't think that's because they've got the capacity that they can use it for entertainment or that kind of thing. It simply reflects the fact that housing is cheaper here in Northern Ontario, in just about all of our regions. In fact, all of the regions, as far as I can recall, our housing is cheaper than the province as a whole. That's good news, but it's also bad news in that it creates a disincentive for future construction. So we're actually starting to see significant indications of a lack of affordable housing, in particular, particularly outside the urban centers, but even in the big five. And so while housing costs for those of us who are buying houses is good news, housing costs and the disincentive to build new housing is problematic for those who are looking for affordable housing. So this is a sword that cuts both ways. Poverty, low income cutoff. So we've got two different measures of poverty. One is apparent lower instances of poverty in Northern Ontario if you use what's called LICO. The low income cutoff, it kind of uses a percentage of the overall income. This would be good news if you were using this as a metric of poverty indication. It suggests that incomes and jobs are available in the north, and that is true. But the challenge you get into is this measure here, which is called the market basket measure. And in fact, the federal government's new anti-poverty strategy is focused on this measure. And as you can see, if you use market basket as opposed, so market basket is the ability to buy things. In simple, I apologize for the economists in the room who want to get a little bit more technical about the differences between the two measures. I'll try to keep it relatively simple. Market basket measure is your ability to buy things. Low income cutoff is how much money comes into your bank account on a monthly basis. And the challenge here is that on a market basket measure, our poverty levels are actually higher than they would otherwise appear. So we have to pay attention to that, particularly in the far north. When you're talking about $35 for a case of Pepsi or $6 for a loaf of bread, you have problems. And that's why you see these numbers so skewed. Growth in the number of children facing challenges. So this is another issue that we have to face. The fact is that if you look at the results on what's called the early development instrument, so it tests kids fairly early on about their capacity to understand, engage, to grasp information that comes into them and then use it for making decisions or correlations. And we see a spike here in Northern Ontario around these measures, that we've got a higher number of kids that are increasingly coming into our schools with challenges in advance of attending. The good news is, on the other end of the equation, we seem to be doing a reasonably good job of addressing those challenges through the course of K-12 education, and then in post-secondary we're seeing post-secondary education levels increase across the board since 2006. That's a good thing. I'll talk a little bit later about whether or not we're educating folks in the areas where work is available to them in Northern Ontario. I'm not one of those who's religious about the idea that we need to educate everybody for a job in their community. I don't have any problem with what's called brain circulation, people leaving to take jobs elsewhere and other people coming. I think that we need to make that easier. And so to me, the fact that overall post-secondary education is going up is a good thing. But that still doesn't answer the fact that we still have lots of jobs that are going wanting because either they don't have the skills for them or they're not interested in them. But that's a different conversation than whether or not we're preparing kids for their future. Let's talk a little bit about demographics, which is what's going to get us into those kind of issues. And of course, I'll get into the labor market in a minute or two. So, Mayor MacDonald was kind enough to remind us that our population is in decline, which is, in fact, it is true, particularly if you look at some of these districts. So you've got Thunder Bay, Algoma, the two yellows I can't read, but I suspect it's Nipissing and Rainy River. Cochrane and Temiskaming are all declining or at a level that's consistent over time. The good news is that, as I told you, not everything is the same, and so we actually do have districts that are seeing population rises. So you see Manitoulin, Parry Sound, Kenora, Greater Sudbury, and Sudbury. So we're seeing some slight spikes or leveling in those districts. So while, yes, if you look at Northeastern Ontario or Northwestern Ontario or Northern Ontario as a whole, population overall is in decline, some of our districts are seeing population growth driven by a couple of things. One, they're driven by population growth in our Indigenous population, particularly in Kenora and Manitoulin. But also, and this is good news, I think, we're starting to see, particularly in Parry Sound and some of the border regions, that those 40,000 people that leave the GTA every year are starting to head our direction. And I think that's good news, and I think that's an opportunity for particularly the Northeast, particularly for communities like North Bay, Sudbury, Timmins, and some of the smaller communities in between. You have something to offer to the folks who are not happy living in the GTA, not happy being unemployed or underemployed in the GTA. And I think that over the next couple of years, we're hoping to see some serious focus by the leaders of our communities to kind of take advantage of that opportunity. We do, however, have an aging population in every district. We're getting older, and that means, of course, that our labor supply is going to start to go down in a exponential way. In other words, we've seen labor force decline with aging. Aging is going to accelerate, which means labor force decline is going to accelerate as well. A couple of projections that we've done with our friends from the workforce planning boards suggest that overall we're talking about 50,000 people that we're going to need. We're talking about immigration levels that I'll show you the slides on later, but somewhere between 1,500 and 5,000 people every year for the next 25 years need to come to Northern Ontario. And that assumes that every person who's facing a challenge now, we solve their problems and get them into the workforce. So that means we've solved every social problem, every economic issue, every connectivity problem, and we're still 50,000 short in 20 years or so. So think of the huge investment, one, in solving those problems, and then two, in attracting the additional people we need anyway. This is the Indigenous population, which is a highlight for every district. It's increased. More importantly, you'll see the big yellow central portion of all those spikes. That's the working age population, and in the Indigenous population, that is growing. And I couldn't agree more when I see people like David Paul Ashton-Padiscom, who came out yesterday talking about the fact that we need to take advantage of that, get the skills that these folks need to get into the workforce and make productive lives for themselves and their families. We are making progress on that. Not, again, just like boil water advisories, not nearly quick enough and not nearly in every sector. I had a wonderful meeting in Pays Plat last year. And one of the questions that was put to the council there was, there's road construction just outside the community. Why aren't the kids there taking the jobs? And it was a very apropos answer. The economic development guy said, well, not every kid wants to drive a truck. And I think we need to understand that these children, these folks who are entering the workforce have plans of their own, and to assume that their interests are going to match the needs of their communities is both naive and a little bit presumptuous, to be quite frank. And so we have to recognize that we're going to prepare them to work, and they may work in Toronto, they may work in Victoria, they may work in South Africa, and that's fine. It's just as fine for them as it was for our kids. But the point is that those who do want to work here have the capacity to learn. We need to help them. And we need to do more than just focusing on the way we're doing it now, which is, not to pick on our policymakers, because they have to go where the electorate's going to lead them. But, we spent millions of dollars training people for the Ring of Fire. I gave a talk in Kirkland Lake last week where I talked about the timeline for the oil sands to come into production. Serious investment in the oil sands started around the turn of the century, started to pick up around 1930s. Production itself didn't start in this oil sands until 1967, so recognize that. We're talking 30 years before they kind of got to a level of serious investment, another 37 before they got to production, and it wasn't until the 80s that some of the communities around the Ring of Fire started to see significant population growth and actual return to the coffers of the province. So when we start investing in the Ring of Fire, expecting that to turn our economy around tomorrow, we're being naive in the extreme. The jobs in the Ring of Fire are real, the assets are there, and they're going to stay there until it's economical to take them out. And that means it could be 5 years or it could be 50. And so we need to start talking about some of the other things that are going on in our communities and not so much about the Ring of Fire. Not that I'd object to a couple of ministers coming up with a bulldozer and building a multi-service road that includes electrification and internet access and natural gas. I'm just saying that don't expect that to turn the economy around in Northern Ontario in one fell swoop. There you go. I couldn't resist, Alex. I'm sorry. We need both newcomers and Indigenous peoples. These are the numbers I was talking to you about earlier. These assume full employment of everybody who's here. I can't say that enough. I really get frustrated when I see mayors and political leaders talk on the radio or on television about an either-or exercise, that we have to take care of our own first, that somehow we have to get all of the Indigenous folks engaged in the economy and then everything is going to be a bed of roses. The simple fact is it's not true. It's not an either-or exercise. We need to do both, and we need to do it quickly. We're decades behind in terms of responding to this challenge, and we need to invest heavily, both resources and people, in terms of addressing these challenges on both sides of that particular coin. And we need to have more babies. I always get in trouble when I say that, but the harsh reality is, and I know there are some who advocate for depopulation or fighting against overpopulation, but the simple fact is overpopulation is not an issue in Northern Ontario. And if we want the communities that we currently have, we're going to have to do all three of these things. Now, if we don't, if we're happy to see Schreiber, Terrace Bay, Chapleau shuttered, added to the list of ghost towns in Northern Ontario, that's fine too, but that's a political decision. My assumption from a working situation is that our goal is to keep, maintain, and grow the communities that we have. And that means we have to invest in all these areas. Demographics, we've got more people leaving Northern Ontario than coming to the region, so I'm just going to see if I can sneak this back. So if you see that there, just on the bottom line projection, the idea that we're going to continue to decline on what's called a demographic dependency ratio. We're going to get to a situation where we've got roughly 1.2 to 1.5 workers to support one dependent. That means we need approximately 1,700 people a year for 25 years. This is our performance on net attraction. You'll notice that the net line never busts zero. So we need 1,700 people a year, and we're starting from scratch. So that's the scope of the challenge that's before us. And I'm happy to say that we're starting to see a consensus building around that. We're starting to see federal policymakers taking seriously the issues for rural and remote immigration and investment in attraction. We're starting to see municipal leaders like the Big Five mayors who have been very aggressive on this topic the last year or so, and kudos to them for doing so. We're seeing more and more the smaller communities, Kirkland Lake, for example, Elliott Lake, Smooth Rock Falls, taking a leadership role in this. We see Sioux Lookout with huge opportunities in terms of jobs that are there and available, high-paying, good quality jobs that you can sustain your family on. So that's good news. So I'm hoping that probably not next year, but maybe the year after, I'll be able to talk about a positive spike in these numbers at the state of the North, wherever we are in that year. And this is my message around this. Remember I was talking about the Ring of Fire and my concern that we spend a little too much time talking about it. One of the things I think we need to do more of is recognize what jobs that are here in the North. I've been working on the immigration file since I was with the Halifax Chamber of Commerce almost 20 years ago. And one of the things that I've seen as a trend is that those who talk about the jobs they want to be here are the ones who fail. Those who talk about the jobs that are here are the ones that become the leaders in the community. You look at Manitoba and what it was able to do in terms of attracting people to the province, and all they did was recognize, you know what, we're not going to get Silicon Valley to move to the name of the community just escaped me, so I'll pick Winnipeg. What was that? Yeah, you can use Mortar, Manitoba. I was going to pick on Christine, but I can't remember where she lived. The PA. There you go. Thank you very much. So we're not going to get Silicon Valley to move to the PA, but we can get people who are prepared to work in slaughterhouses to move. We've got in Manitoba an industry that was thriving, that was growing, and had a capacity to grow further, and they brought people. And it was ugly, and I'm sure that very few of us in this room will be prepared to do that job, but there were lots of people who were prepared to do the job, interested in it, had the skills, and they came to Manitoba and they raised families. And this is the list of jobs that are available both in the Northeast and the Northwest. And one of the things that I try to highlight is, look at the yellow marks. These are the top 10 jobs by jobs that have been advertised, literally advertised for employment in the Northeast and the Northwest based on data that was collected by the workforce planning boards. 7 of 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of 10, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. So 7 of 10 in both instances are not covered by current immigration streams. People in these mid-skilled jobs are not valued by our national policymakers. But I can tell you they are certainly going to be valued by the communities where these jobs are going wanting. And I did a little math using an employment calculator that our friends in the Workforce Planning Board in Thunder Bay put together. And people like to make fun of Thunder Bay or of Tim Hortons or McDonald's. Actually, it was quite a nice little segue. I was doing this talk again in Kirkland Lake last week, and someone made a joke about, well, let's just get a Tim Hortons. So I put up the numbers for a Tim Hortons franchise in a community like Sioux Lookout. And we're talking about $1 million into the economy. We're talking about 32 jobs. We're talking about increase in the tax roll. We're talking about purchasing houses. So you can mock Tim Hortons or McJobs all you want, but if those are the jobs that are available, if your local hotel is half-staffed, if your local transportation company can't find drivers, that's going to have a long-term cyclical impact, and it's going to go downward. But if you fill those jobs, it means that your community has 3, 5, 10 extra years to find the next big thing, to wait for the mill to open or the mine to open, or to find somebody who creates new jobs. Looking at statistics that I saw yesterday, the next generation of women entrepreneurs to come into your town, create jobs, and grow the economy with small businesses. They do much better job than men, apparently, and we have lots of those underutilized resources here in our community. I know that I'm getting off script and I'm probably killing my time, but I'll tell you a little story. I was in Red Lake, And I was surprised to see that the National Association of Home-Based Businesses was having their AGM in Red Lake. And I was trying to figure out why. And it turns out that they have a massive number of home-based businesses that do e-commerce, because there are one parent is home in the house and has time on their hands. And so they have a huge home-based business exercise going in Red Lake. They're bringing money into the community by selling services and things that they put together in their houses. That's an opportunity that others of us can follow. But again, it's one of those things, recognizing that small entrepreneurs, 1-2 person shops, make a difference in our economy. And I don't think that gets said nearly enough. It used to get said a lot, but we're kind of moving away from it. How am I doing for time, Haley? Excellent. I'll slow down. I lied. Labor market, integration in the labor market. So this is the other challenge we have around who's participating, who's not participating. And if you see in the labor market, we've got lower participation rates compared to Ontario and Canada, particularly in the north. Does that say northwest is the blue? Quick, Alex, tell me. Northeast is the blue, so particularly in the northeast. And again, this gets back to the age cohort. We're older than the rest of the province, and so they're moving away from the workforce. The other challenge that we have in particularly our larger centers, even the mid-sized centers, the centers that we're talking about, 15,000, 7,000 people, we are a government-dependent economy in large swaths of our communities, and the average retirement age in the government is around 54 years old. So they're not hanging around till they're 65. So not only do we have an older population, we have a population that tends to retire earlier than the rest of the country and the rest of the province. And so that has an impact on who we have available to work, which kind of explains why retailers are so happy when our international student cohort comes to town in September of every year. Integration in labor market, and this is the good news. So all of those old folks, no apologies for generalizations in that regard, but when those folks leave the economy, it creates opportunities. And so we actually have among the highest employment rates for youth. If your kids want to find a job, it's far easier for them on a statistical basis to stay home. Not go to the GTA, not go to Vancouver, not go to Montreal. They're going to find work here quicker, and it's going to be good work for the most part, full-time work. And we'll talk about that in a second. And so in many cases, when you're sitting around those breakfast tables, there is a case to be made for staying home. I'm not advocating that you make it in every case, but sometimes there's a fit, and if you want a job here in the north, generally you can find it. Integration in the labor market, the proportion of full-time jobs increased in Northern Ontario. So remember I was going to tell you about full-time jobs? This is not the part-time job-driven economy that we've seen in the past. Full-time jobs are up. That's good news. It means that these are permanent spots where you can build a life around. Integration in the labor market, and we're going to break it down by 3 populations. We're going to look at francophones, we're going to look at newcomers, and we're going to look at the Indigenous population. And in each case, we've got a little bit of a different story. So the employment rate for francophones compared to that of overall population in 2016, francophones tend to be a little bit behind the overall population. Some districts are closer than others. And again, the primary driver of this is age. The francophone population also tends to be slightly older than the rest of us. So if you think about that, Northern Ontario is older than the rest of Ontario, and the francophones are even older than the majority of the population here. So that's part of the thing that's driving this. Employment rate among immigrants compared to that of overall, you see in some instances immigrants actually outperform those in the district, particularly in the Rainy River area. But in some areas they still fall well below, particularly in Greater Sudbury, in the Sudbury region, for example. That's problematic because these folks are coming, they have skills, they have interests, and they want to take care of their families. And so we've got challenges ongoing in terms of that. The other thing, of course, is that this is a carry-on impact, right? If these folks who are here now are having a challenge finding jobs for themselves or their spouses or their children, they're going to send those messages home. They're not going to send the messages home about low-cost housing, great communities, safe communities, wonderful schools. They're going to send the message back that there's no work here. So we have to identify what kind of barriers are in place, whether it's skills recognition, whether it's matching to the employers or what have you, and address that. Because there's lots of success stories on this file. The other bad news side is around the Indigenous population. So remember that I told you early on that these are our 2 biggest issues, and these are the two areas where we need to make maximum progress in the earliest possible time. And we continue to fall down in terms of employment rate of Indigenous population compared to that of the overall. They are behind the rest of us everywhere. And that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed in a serious way, and it's not going to be cheap. The long-term impacts of past historical policies, I think we're all reasonably well aware of it now, and the simple fact is that ripple effect is going to continue for at least another 2 generations, and so we need to recognize that and do whatever we can to mitigate it and make sure that the ripple effect gets lesser and less and shortened in terms of its time of impact. But the good news is, and I think I want to emphasize this, if you look at the Northeast in particular compared to the Northwest, as you see infrastructure improve, as you see those roads go in, as you see a grid start to create, as you see opportunities for leaving your community and getting jobs, or living in your community and getting jobs elsewhere, level of education goes up among the Indigenous population, dependence goes down among the Indigenous population, health outcomes go up, and incomes go up. That means that it can be done, and it can be done using many of the policy tools that we're already using. And I think that's the positive message. I think we need to recognize that it's not an impossible task. We are making progress, and it's important to recognize both the challenge and the opportunity in these numbers. Let's talk a little bit about the economy. So let's talk about opportunities. So this is the economic base, GDP growth in the Northeast. There's a slight decline in the Northwest. So the challenge we have is you need to look at what kind of opportunities we are going to create, what kind of jobs we're going to see, and whether or not we're actually seeing investment from the outside. And so you see the Northwest is the yellow line, the Northeast is the blue line. So we continue to be below Ontario and Canada on a per capita GDP basis, but we're seeing upward trends in the Northeast, and we're seeing a stabilization in the Northwest. That's good news. Not nearly as good news as I was hoping to tell you this year, but I can tell you that some of what we call leading indicators, so things like exploration, investment in mineral assessments, investment in housing, have all started to spike in the last couple of quarters. So that suggests that there's some good things happening in some of our communities. I don't see it on a wide-ranging basis yet, but I do see it in places like Timmins. I see it in areas around Fort Francis. I certainly see it in the areas around Parry Sound, and to a certain extent here in the environs of North Bay. And that's good news, because that suggests that barring some global calamity, we'll see some growth in the next couple of years. GDP per capita is higher in Greater Sudbury than the rest of Ontario. That shouldn't be a surprise. Lots of the jobs there are both in the education sector and in mining and minerals, and so they tend to have a higher average income. But the good news is on this graph that just about every district, there's a couple exceptions, we're doing slightly better than we were just a few years ago, and so that's good news as well. Again, not nearly the growth rates that you see nationally and provincially, but growth nonetheless. Employment diversity by industry. This is one of the factors that we like to look at, because you hear a lot about the fact that the North is hewers of wood, drawers of water, that all we do is cut trees down or dig things out of the ground. The fact is 18% of our employment is in that sector, 18%. So 80% of us are working somewhere else. And economic diversity looks at this number and assesses it on the basis of employment by employment diversity. And what we see on this measure is that there's an overall decrease in employment diversity by industry for both the Northeast and the Northwest. And I would suggest that a large portion of this is pushed by the fact that we've seen a decline in the last couple of years in those two industries. And so we're seeing a greater concentration of folks working in areas like health and education and public service. You look at those numbers broken out by district, and it's decreased to remain the same in most districts since 2001, but it has increased overall in Ontario as a whole. And you'll notice the two exceptions there, Rainy River and Sudbury. And those of you who've been paying attention, you'll have noticed that I've said Sudbury and Rainy River a couple of times in terms of highlighting exceptions to the overall trend. Rainy River is actually seeing some pretty exciting stuff around the agricultural industry, and Sudbury, of course, is seeing more investment in the mine sector. So it's starting to kind of come back. Plus, you're seeing some investment in the transportation side. So that's part of the reason that's driving those kind of slips from the overall trends. Then you got investment in business attraction. Every trend analysis, every economist will tell you not to get excited by single year data, but I have to admit that the end of this chart looks much better than the middle of this chart, in that you see spikes in the last couple of years. And so I'm hoping that next year and the year after I'll be able to talk about trends in the upward direction, but really that depends more on you than it does on us. But certainly whatever we've been doing the last couple of years seems to be having an impact. Investment in business attraction, we're seeing more businesses with employees per 10,000 population, particularly in Manitoulin and Parry Sound, and again, that Rainy River district. So again, Rainy River is not only seeing the agricultural stuff, they've also had 3 gold mines, or 2. If Emilio was here, he could tell me, but anyway, we'll check that and get back to you. But again, it's starting to see those kind of growth. Investment in business attraction, this is the other thing. When the recession hit in 2008, 2009, these numbers were atrocious. Business bankruptcies spiked, and it was a real challenge for us. What we've seen over time is that the weaker companies essentially have now left the economy, and increasingly what we're seeing is the ability to sustain themselves over time. That's good news. It means that the stronger companies are here and they're ready for growth, and so as the growth happens, our ability to take advantage of it will be enhanced. I think this section is the last section, so let's talk about income and how all of these trends are impacting the overall performance or the reality day to day for those of us who live and work in Northern Ontario. And this shows us the median income has increased since 2006 in every district. So even the districts that are having challenges around people leaving the workforce, even the districts that are having challenges around declines or continuing declines in GDP or a lack of diversification, is seeing overall income going up. The good news is that an economy that faces labor shortages is good news for workers. We're paying higher salaries. The private sector, you hear a lot when you hear about, we talk about responding to the labor skills shortage in the country, about the private sector and its inability or refusal to step up and pay higher salaries, particularly in the debate around the minimum wage issue. The fact is that if you look at salaries, average salaries using the labor force wage survey that StatsCan does, our private sector employers have stepped up to the plate. In income and wages in many of the sectors where we're facing challenges have actually gone up. Have they gone up enough? I can't answer that question, but at least they have identified that they have to pay better salaries, because the simple fact is, if an employee has a choice between 5 jobs and you want them, you're going to have to make your job more attractive than the job next door. And that's, again, good news. We look at income among the francophone population versus after-tax income, and you see the overall population is in blue, right? You'd think I'd be able to see that from here. Clearly, I need a new prescription. In any event, this is an area where it's interesting to see. Remember, because the participation of francophones is lower than the rest of the population, but their income levels tend to be higher. So they're in professions where they're seeing a greater level of income. So again, it's one of those things where you can find a little bit of good news and a little bit of bad news in these slides for whatever community you come from, for whatever population mix you have. Look at income for the immigrant population, and again, it's a situation where, if you remember, in many of the jurisdictions, they were underrepresented. At least here in a couple of jurisdictions, particularly in, again, Kenora and Rainy River, you're seeing income levels higher than the overall average population. But again, for the rest of us, there tends to be a little bit of a disconnect between the immigrant population, what they're making, versus the overall population as a whole. And I wish I could say that this next slide is going to be a surprise, but it won't be, I don't think, to anybody. the gaps between what the Indigenous population make as a median income and what the rest of us make are significant in many of our communities. And again, that reflects that in many instances we're talking about entry-level positions, low-skill positions, mid-skill positions. And so economically, they're a decade or two behind us to be charitable. And so again, it's one of those things where we have to invest, and we have to invest now, because if they've got 4 or 5 steps on the employment ladder to catch up to the rest of us, we can't wait another 5 years to get them on the ladder and starting up. Nor can we afford, economically speaking, to have this resource of skills unrepresented in our workplace and in our communities. So I hate to end on a low note, but we do have to be realistic about the challenges we face, and the fact that every challenge is really an opportunity. And if we look at it that way, I think that we have an opportunity here to invest in those two large population groups, and a third population group which is increasingly better represented. You know, when I started looking at economic indicators and growth policies 30 odd years ago after graduating from university, we spent a lot of time talking about the lack of female representation in the economy. I'm happy to say that over the course of my professional career, we've seen that improved exponentially to the point now where we're talking about solving the last kind of frontier, which is female representation at the highest levels of private business, and for the most part, they are fully engaged in the rest of the economy. Particularly, I'm happy to say, on the entrepreneurial side. If you look at the numbers in terms of businesses that were started by women last year, it outperforms men. If you look at the number of small businesses that increased employment last year, those run by women outperformed men. And so I guess my hope is that another 20 years, when I'm ready to retire, we can talk about the fact that all 3 of these populations are achieving at that level. And so there's no more worry about the Indigenous population and the newcomers, that we will all be actually on that famous level playing field that we talk so much about. So in any event, on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Q&A, but I'll give you this message, which is to enjoy the conference. The theme this year is taxing for growth. You may ask why we're talking about taxes. The simple answer is that it's been a long time since we looked at the tax mix in the country in a serious way. Lots of people have done it on one-off kind of exercise. And so there's lots of questions about competitiveness, about how that impacts our various regions, and whether or not we actually can attract the investment that we need and the people that we need into Northern Ontario. The other flip side of the equation, and this is one that many people who don't like taxes don't like to talk about, which is we have an infrastructure deficit in Northern Ontario, and the money's going to have to come from somewhere. And it's unlikely that it's going to come from taxpayers in the GTA. So to the extent that we're hoping to close some of the infrastructure gaps that keep us from maximizing the economic opportunities, particularly in the far north or in our remote communities, we're going to have some painful conversations what we pay for and what we don't, some of the things that we might have to get rid of, some of the things we might have to pay more for. And so that's kind of your job over the next 2 days, is to have those tough conversations about whether we're balancing what we need to attract, and our ability to pay for those kind of investments. By all means, if we can convince a greater level of equalization, and that's the argument that we come to, then let's have that conversation. So we're talking about addressing the challenges around optimum tax strategies, around competitiveness. We're going to have a panel tomorrow about some of the interesting things that are going on in First Nations communities around local taxation that allows to sustain services and make their communities more sustainable. We're going to talk about the evidence of the value of experimenting with policy options. This is a message that's often tough for Canadian public servants and politicians to get their heads around. The idea being that there are areas where we can naturally experiment with public policy and see how the theory plays out on the ground. And the simple fact is that Northern Ontario is ideal for that because of our distance from other markets. So it's comparatively easy to be able to differentiate the impact of a policy if you do it in Thunder Bay, or if you do it in North Bay, or along the Timiskaming shore, than if you do it in Toronto or if you do it in Vancouver. And the fascinating thing is that internationally, this is becoming more and more the theme, more and more the case, that the folks in North Europe in particular are comfortable with the idea that they're going to experiment, that there's going to be differential taxes, there's differential service delivery. There's going to be online service delivery in one community for a couple of years while they figure out the kinks, and then they'll move to expanding it. And I think that's an exciting opportunity, and one we don't talk about enough here, because frankly, we spend a lot of time talking about what the other person has and how come we don't have it too. And to the extent that we continue with that mindset, it's going to be a real challenge for us to aggressively find and experiment with solutions that we know are going to work. We're going to constantly see ourselves in a situation where we're putting in place more and more cookie cutter solutions that don't work, and then restarting again and restarting again and restarting again. And that's a danger. And it's a danger because frankly, we don't have the time to mess around anymore. We've got to find some solutions that work, and we've got to find them that work for our communities. So on that note, I'm going to get, I hope, to my famous last slide where I say thank you, merci, miigwech, and open the floor to questions. I think you're supposed to tell us who you are and then ask your question.
Okay. My name is Jeanpierre Chabot. I'm one of the newer board members of NPI, and I reside currently in Moose Factory, so I can appreciate the regionalness of Ontario's north, and I appreciate all the presentation. There's a lot of new stuff there from my standpoint and perspective. This is very valuable information. I was wondering actually about Rainy River. I know some people that are there, and I'm just curious, what is it about the agricultural sector, if you have a little bit more information about why Rainy River is a bit of a phenomenon, I guess, in some of these indicators.
So Rainy River's got two things that seem to be spiking most significantly. One, of course, being the gold mines that are coming online, but the other being in the agricultural sector. And interestingly, what's going on in the agricultural sector in Rainy River is mirrored by the same sort of thing here in the Northeast, particularly around Timmins, Cochrane area. You're seeing the price of farmland in the areas around the GTA spike to the point where they're simply not affordable. And so we're seeing Amish community and Mennonite communities move to purchase land as part of their cultural kind of transfer. My understanding is, they have to make allowance for the next generation and find land to expand. And so we're seeing those communities naturally migrate to where the land is cheaper, which makes perfect sense. And of course, they become a leading indicator to the industry as a whole. And in this area on the Northeast, I can say that we spent 2 years ago, I think we were at a research center on the Quebec side looking at agriculture, and I found it fascinating that they put up a Google Maps image, a aerial shot of the border, and if you look on the right-hand side, which is in Quebec, it's all cut up into individual plots. People are using it very aggressively for agricultural purposes, and on the Ontario side, it's empty. But it's the same geography, the same water, the same land, the same quality, and somehow something's happening, or something happened on the Quebec side that did not happen on this side. And to me, as a policymaker, as a student of public policy, that's a clear indication that we need to get something right on the left-hand side of that line. And to a certain extent, we're seeing investment by NOHFC and others around supporting what's called tile drainage, so enhancing the productivity of land by investing in creating water drainage and kind of getting it off so the capacity so you're able to grow crops there. I think that's paying dividends. And as I said, we've got those communities both in Rainy River and in the Northeast that are leading indicators that suggest there's going to be a big trend towards growing agriculture opportunities in those regions. And it's to the point now where the economic development officers in those regions have identified that and are starting to aggressively go after it. So I think we're going to see that continue to expand.
Yeah, hi. My name is Toby Sanger, and I'll be on a panel later. One thing that I found interesting was the migration net migration slide, and there was net gain in international migration in the north, but then a loss through intra-provincial. Can you talk a little bit more about what's behind that?
So. And again, I'm speculating wildly, but I'll do that freely because that's what I get paid to do. So if you look at some of the numbers that are underneath there, what we're seeing, in particular in our working age population or those who are entering post-secondary, they tend to jump over top of our institutions and go south. So I was we did an analysis of Timmins and the opportunity for post-secondary expansion there last year. Spent a lot of time kind of sitting on the ground talking to counselors and high school students, and their interest is to kind of go to the big city. And so that's a challenge around that, and to a certain extent, particularly in the forestry and mining sector, particularly in the Northwest, we saw a lot of departures out to the oil sands when they were booming and we were not. And as a general rule, they're not coming home. So if you go, I visited a mill in Ear Falls, for example, which had just come online. They'd love to have a second shift. They can't find enough people. And the people they do have, they've got a workforce that's made up 60% of women, which, according to the mill manager, is an aberration in the industry. But what seems to be happening, and I've got some family and some friends in Ear Falls, is that it seems that the men are working in the mine in Red Lake, and the women are working in the mill in Ear Falls, which is a good thing for those who want to work in that field. But again, it's a challenge to kind of attract, and it indicates that those who worked in the mill the first time weren't hanging around waiting for it to open the second time around. That's the same thing when you look at various mills elsewhere. There's lots of mills that now have a demand for the second shift, but their workers have left or retired, and they're not prepared to take the risk in the industry again. So that's an ongoing challenge. So I think that's primary driver. The other thing, of course, is you're seeing urbanization in Northern Ontario starting to reach the levels that globally we've been at for probably the last 20 odd years or so. So Canada was kind of slow to catch up to the global urbanization trend, and Northern Ontario was a little slower still. So that's kind of happening. One of the interesting things, doesn't get into the intra-provincial migration trends, is that the number one source of new people arriving in Thunder Bay is Kenora, and the number one source of new people arriving in Kenora is Thunder Bay. So we tend to trade each other people sometimes too.
Thanks. Gail Broad, Nordic Institute, Algoma University, Sault Ste. Marie. You mentioned a couple of times, first of all, I want to congratulate you on using sort of a triple bottom line in terms of aggregating indicators of where the North is going, or the state of the North right now in terms of addressing people, planet, and the economy. And of course, as you know, Charles, I'm very interested in social enterprises, home-based businesses, small business startup. And I'm wondering about whether you are looking at doing some analysis of how that growth is happening, or whether that growth is happening in the North, and what kinds of policies are supporting that kind of growth in the North. Because I think right now the federal government seems to be shifting perhaps into, there's an expectation that they're going to be coming out with more supportive programs and policies around that kind of business startup, while at the same time there's an expectation that the province is probably going in the other direction. So I'm just wondering if you're planning on looking into that in a little more depth over the next year or two, in terms of analyzing what some of the policy supports have been in that field. So
the quick answer is, for the next 18 months, likely no. We've done some preliminary work around trends in entrepreneurialism and job growth, and we've done some work with the Paro Network and others around policies that were in place, particularly provincially, that were working very well in terms of starting enterprises in Northern Ontario that ended up being cut because provincially the take-up wasn't at a level that the province felt at the time was justifying the investment. Again, that's an indication or a highlight yet again that policies that work in Northern Ontario may not necessarily be appropriate for the rest. And so we had take-up rates of 35 and 40% in terms of participation, and then successful entrepreneurial institutions coming out of that, and small businesses. But in many cases in Southern Ontario, they had other opportunities that were easier to take up, and so that program didn't happen. MPI is kind of interesting as a think tank in that the way we set our research agenda is based on what we call the top 10 list of issues. So we have what we call issue baskets. So we've got filters set aside for federal folks, provincial folks, Indigenous community, and so elected officials, unelected officials fall into those categories. We've got one set aside for our volunteers. It's one of the perks of being a volunteer at MPI. You get your own filter. One set aside for experts and staff, but all told there's 10 of them, and we look on a quarterly basis about the issues that are coming up in those groups, messages that we get, feedback we get from events like this, and support for entrepreneurs has cracked the top 10 a couple times over our first 5 years. But it's not nearly as high a priority as I think I would have expected it to be. And so over the next 18 months, we've got projects in areas like partnership with Indigenous communities, infrastructure assessment, some work on the education field, particularly some areas in transportation, but only some minor stuff in the side around social entrepreneurial and progress in that sector. That being said, I'll highlight the fact that there's 3 ways that you can get on the MPI agenda. One is through the filters. 2 is by doing the work yourself, and we're more than happy to kind of promote that work as we've done with Nordic in the past. And the other one is through partnerships. So I've still got a little bit of money set aside in the partnership fund, so if Nordic has some thoughts, we'd always be happy to sit down and have a chat. And anybody else too.
Hello, bonjour. My name is James Parisi. I work at the Timmins Economic Development Corporation. And this is something I've brought up in the office based on an email you'd sent about 2 weeks ago. But it's how to reconcile the paradox where one slide it showed post-secondary education is growing, but another slide you showed that the jobs that are not filled are the C and D levels, which are just high school or no high school. And I don't see how we can convince politicians to say we need to attract unskilled labor.
Well,
for lack of a better, I know it's not, but for lack of a better term,
so
I'd say it.
I would have 3 responses to that. First is I don't necessarily categorize all the jobs that are going wanting as unskilled. I think that there's a lot of them that fall in the category of middle skilled, and I think we do an injustice to many of the middle skilled jobs by calling them middle skilled jobs. Driving a transfer truck is not something that's easy to do. It involves a certain amount of training. Personal support workers are still counted as middle skilled jobs. Health technicians are still counted as middle skilled jobs. So those college graduates in those post-secondary numbers, those are the folks that fill those jobs. So that's response number 1. Response number 2, I think, is this. We tend to forget our history. We tend to forget how both the Indigenous community and those who came after them grew Northern Ontario. They didn't all come here. We didn't all come here with PhDs. We came with a willingness to work, and if that meant we took an entry-level job, we took an entry-level job that was low-skilled. And I think that what we see in today's economy is that the retail sector is equivalent now to what the farm worker used to be, and the forestry worker used to be. And I think that we have to have a certain level of confidence that the folks who are looking for a safer place to raise their family can productively add to the communities by taking those low-skilled jobs and supporting their kids and being the next generation PhDs and engineers and mill workers and miners. I think that that this obsession that the country has with high-skilled immigrants is going to undermine and has undermined our economy. And my third point was, I think that post-secondary education, broadly defined, including college, is a good thing, and I'm not as fussed. If we have a couple of slides that put up what's called graduation rates in sectors versus demand or expected demand, and what we see is a huge disconnect. We're training lots and lots of lawyers, And not that I have anything against lawyers, being one myself, but frankly, Northern Ontario doesn't need any more lawyers. So whatever lawyers we're training here, we can expect the vast majority of them to go somewhere else. And that was the same case for teachers for a long time, and we're still oversupply of teachers. So there are still positions that are not being trained in Northern Ontario that could be, and that again is particularly in those trade sectors, in those middle and high skilled trades areas, but it's also in things like tourism, culture, hospitality management, and business management more generally. So there are opportunities to kind of make a better fit and to find students in our schools early on who are interested in those careers but don't know they exist in their communities. So we're doing a bad job in kind of identifying that, but everybody does a bad job at that. So if we find the solution, we can market it to the rest of the world and make a massive profit.
Second question. I was just recalling a book that I'd read. I don't know if you've come across it, Plowing the Fields. It was written by a couple of Harvard professors on Latin America.
Yeah.
It was the kind of the Andean region and some of the things that were holding them back. One of the things was one of the recommendations they had was for government to become more of an enabler in growth. So really looking at government, totally different viewpoint, because in some of those countries in Latin America, in the Andean region, government was more of it was a very strong bureaucracy, and there was almost a wall between the bureaucracy and everybody else, and it was structured that way culturally and historically as well. But I'm just wondering if in Northern Ontario, if this, and just trying to understand it a little bit better where we're going with the taxation, is that really about government becoming an enabler for growth and from that perspective? Just wondering.
So the good news for me is I get to give my standard answer, which is I don't know. That's up to you guys. So you may sit at your tables and have a conversation and decide, by God, government needs to do more. That we need to raise our taxes and direct our investments and tell those kids to take those jobs driving the trucks, and that's the only way to move the economy forward. I can tell you I would think you'd be wrong, but that doesn't mean that the rest of you in the room don't necessarily think that's the way to go. I suspect that our provincial government would probably prefer, the current provincial government would probably prefer to go to the enabler route. My job is to talk about what the best policy is, regardless of political context, which means that my life is easy some days and hard other days. But that's the beauty of the work. So my painfully obtuse answer is I don't know. You guys will have to tell me what you think. I certainly have strong perspectives on what works and what doesn't, and I suspect our panelists are going to share their ideas. And I'm willing to bet that Toby and I probably agree on about 82% of things, and the other 18 we'll agree to disagree. But we'll see. He may surprise me. Wouldn't be the first time.
I have a question about transient workers, the ones fly in, fly out at the mine sites, the impacts those are having on the communities, and how are they assessed in some of this information? So
that's an issue that keeps coming up, and we continue to do work on it. It's remarkably difficult to identify what numbers are coming in, coming out, because of course, in many cases, the only potential accurate supply is the employer themselves, and that becomes commercially owned enterprise or enterprise information. The interesting thing is if you look at the numbers around wood buffalo and oil sands, they've actually been able to identify and estimate what they call a shadow population. So we're working with them to figure out how exactly what their methodology is and how it works. And to the extent that we can get that in place, we'll be able to start estimating not only the fly-in, fly-out impact for the communities where they're flying in and flying out of, but where they're flying in and flying out from. And that also has an impact for communities like Thunder Bay, for instance, that has a large cyclical population that comes in, consumes services at a particular period of time, and then goes back to another community. And so for the purposes of health transfers, education transfers, those types of things, in large part, those numbers aren't generally included. There's some exceptions to that generalization, but it is a challenge to be able to recognize that those service demands exist and to make sure that we've got models to predict them. But that is an area that comes up on a regular basis, and it's one that we're exploring, but it's difficult to find answers.
Good morning, bonjour. My name is Kim Morris, and I'm the Dean of Health Sciences at Collège Boréal. And I'm glad my colleague from Timmins is back in the room. The whole PSW issue, I call it a PSW crisis, is really top of mind. In the francophone areas, not only we have the additional burden of recruiting and retaining a bilingual health professional workforce. It's difficult enough to get our kids to stay in Northern Ontario to learn and to come to post-secondary. My PSW program, I have trouble recruiting a cohort per year. It is not what you would call sexy career, and I fear, because you saw the statistics, especially the francophone, we're older, and the needs are greater, and it is, I don't know, and we've talked about this at the dean levels of the post-secondary colleges, there's no easy fix to this. And I fear, because yes, those little communities like Sturgeon Falls, like Warren, like Verner, they're going to disappear because the people are getting older and there's no one there. Even if you have the money to pay somebody to help you, there's nobody to help you. So I don't know that there's an easy fix, absolutely not. I don't know what we're going to do about this though, because it is now a crisis.
So before I answer that question, I was handed a note that I was asked to let those people know that we've got a photographer wandering around the room somewhere. There she is over there. Her name is Fen. For those of you who would prefer not to have your picture taken, just let Fen know gently, and she'll avoid any untoward incidents. So I appreciate your cooperation in that regard. In terms of PSWs, I couldn't agree more. And you're right, it's going to get worse. Because the older population is going to continually have an expectation that those services are going to be provided, and as the population moves out of the workforce, it'll become increasingly hard to find people to fill those jobs. In terms of training our own, I have had some interesting conversations, particularly with elders from Indigenous communities, around the fact that in many instances that kind of caring for the elders caring for the older population in the community is something that is a cultural fit. And so my understanding from some of the colleges is that that's an area where they're hoping to see some growth, and there's already some pilots in that area. I don't think it's going to be enough to respond to the demand, but certainly at least we've identified that as a local solution that addresses a couple of problems, and hopefully we'll see that go forward. I think on the francophone side, it's going to be much the same as what you see in the retail sector in areas of Atlantic Canada, where the simple fact is there's no one who wants those jobs locally. And so you're going to have to go to Northwest Africa, to areas overseas where there are French-speaking populations who have those skills or are interested in developing those skills and coming here. And the good news for francophone communities, and frankly for mixed communities or communities majority Anglophone, is that there are a lot of programs in place to get francophone population moving into the north on an expedited basis, so the wait is shorter. There are pay subsidies available, and so to the extent that you've got a bilingual person, perhaps looking for an opportunity in Anglo institutions or francophone institutions looking to hire personal support workers, your problem is a lot easier than the problem of your Anglo counterparts in places like Thunder Bay or Kenora. That's not to make light of your situation. It's just to say that the good news is, comparatively speaking, you're slightly better off than the others, if that's any consolation at all.
And just want to make a few comments about the agricultural land prices. I think what's happening in Smithering Shores area is that the price of land has increased so much that it's pushed the beef industry out of our area, and we've been left with the cash crop and dairy industries. I think that beef industry hasn't quite came back into fruition in the Cochrane, Englehart areas. I think it's coming. It's probably maybe 5 or 10 years down the road there before it actually the economy actually picks up because of the beef industry in that area. So just wonder whether your MPI or you or Pierre have done any forecasting as far as where the agriculture industry is going in Northeast Ontario.
So we haven't done any forecasting on a particular industry basis, but one of the things that we've got coming in the next probably 16 months, I would think, is taking a serious look at what's called the ingredients for clusters, industry clusters in a region. And so we're looking at some of the models that the US uses and other jurisdictions use around not so much assessing where a cluster should be, but whether a cluster already exists or potential for a cluster already exists, and getting a handle on what we're talking about in terms of skills availability, resource availability, existing investment trends, those kind of measures. And I think that will highlight some of those things around the beef and agriculture industry that some of us might be slightly surprised about, I think, in terms of the overall growth. I have to say that that when I moved to Northern Ontario 6 years ago, I wasn't expecting agriculture to be as big a player in some of the jurisdictions as it is. And so it's interesting for us to kind of get a feel for where the potential is that is being undertapped. We identified, I say we, the provincial government identified, I think it was 11 areas of focus in the growth plan from 2011. And so the question now is, are those 11 still the ones that represent the most potential for us? The Feds just released their, what do they call it, a cluster strategy or industry tables yesterday, talking about areas nationally that they see as the greatest opportunity. So we'll be looking at that and see how it plays out in Northern Ontario, and perhaps seeing if there's a way to expand it to do some local analysis. That's the case with many of the pieces that we end up doing, is that there's lots of analysis from TD Bank and RBC, et cetera, around economic trends in the country as a whole. And generally that methodology can kind of be used to take a serious look at Northern Ontario. Largely you have to find proxy measures, but it's an interesting tool and it's pre-existing and tested. So it's one of those things where we'd like to see a little bit more of that done. Excellent. So I want to thank you all for your interesting questions. Encourage you to continue to ask those questions, both of our panelists and our speakers, and of each other. So they tell me that I can let you loose to, visit the facilities, have a coffee or whatever, and then insist that you're back at the table within 10 minutes so that you can have a fascinating conversation with each other about how wrong I am. Thank you very much.